Hello guys and welcome back to HJW Gaming. In this video I'm going to be producing a full guide on both basic and advanced war tactics that can help you and your fellowship perform better on the battlefield. The resource you'll see in the background is something I typed up for my Discord server home. If anyone wants a copy of this to put in their own Discord, just please let me know down in the comments and I can be sure to get back to you. And if there's anything you think I've missed, also let me know down in the comments and I can be sure to take notes and update in the future. Anyway, into the first part of this video, and the first of that is going to be very basic tactics. Now, this is kind of more for beginners, as I'm sure a lot of people will be doing this already, but I just wanted to talk through some of the kind of very basic tactics. And the first of those is public battle reports. So if those of you who have just picked up the game, if you don't know already, you can view public battle reports. So you don't just have to see the reports that you get in your personal mailbox. To do this, you can go to your mail and then you can switch the filter over by clicking the filter icon to Fellowship to see all reports that are being dealt to your Fellowship tiles or Fellowship armies. Alternatively, if you want to see specific reports on a tile that you don't own, you can click the tile, click the little scroll icon, and then you can view the reports on that by switching the filter over to Fellowship if it isn't on there already, and then you can see what armies are battling on that tile. The reason this is useful is you can take a look at what army is battling on there and you can potentially spec your troops out up against this, or be sure to send the correct member of your fellowship who can deal with the army on that tile, so you can therefore improve your results by knowing what you're coming up against. The next of this is last in, first out, which is kind of talking through basic tile mechanics. Now this describes how, when you're battling on a tile, which armies come out first if you have multiple armies on the same tile. And this is last in, first out. What that means is if you stack armies on a tile, say you've got 5 armies stacked, whichever one arrived 5th will be the first one drawn out when the enemy hits. So whoever arrived first will be the last to come out. The only way to change this is through activating a guard, and a guard will automatically jump you to the top of the line. If there are multiple of you guarding, it'll be whoever was the last one to guard. So it'll go in that same order again of guards, and then once they're run out, it will then go in tile arrival, last to first order. So hopefully that helps you kind of understand a little bit more, because I know when I first started 2.0 in particular, that guarding description is a change on Rise to War Classic, and it took me a little while to get used to. So yeah, it's an effective feature which can help you make sure that you're using the right armies to engage the right opponents again, so that you have a little bit more effectiveness in battle by making sure you're putting out the right armies. And then next up is just talking through bouncing and what a bounce is. So this is where an enemy cannot legally attack a tile. So if an enemy is sending upon a tile that looks to occupy, they might be doing it to try and bounce you, or to maybe block an area, or kind of cut one of your paths. The way you can bounce them is if you take that tile, they then cannot take that tile without occupying it themselves. So if you take it, you can do what's called bounce them. You should always try and aim to bounce players if you can, as this will waste tons of enemy stamina. Because if you can take a tile with a very weak army and they're sending their main, you're using up 20 stamina of a weak army, whereas you're making them waste 20 stamina on the bounce and then another 20 stamina to send to an adjacent tile. So you can waste up stamina of the opponent's most effective armies, which what that will then do is that will then stop them from using their most effective armies the best they possibly can, so you can just waste their effectiveness whilst keeping your own armies topped up with stamina, basically. You can also do this with reinforcements. So when your opponent has reinforcements coming in, you can see this by the travel lines, and usually reinforcement armies go pretty quick, but if you spot the travelling lines of your opponent, you can block them off by basically taking tiles along that path to stop them being able to reach that commander. You'll then bounce their reinforcements back to base, which means they'll have to unblock that area and then send them again, so you waste again a ton of time and a ton of stamina as they try and unclear and resend those reinforcements. So that's just kind of some of the very basic tactics. I'm now going to talk through settlements, as settlements is again one of the key things. Anyone who's a veteran player will obviously be aware of this, but it's kind of best to talk through it for those who are not aware. So settlement position is one of the most important things for PvP. You should always try and have you and your fellowship settlements placed in the best way possible. Ideally, you'd place it within a good range of the front line. Reason being is the closer you are, the shorter your reinforcement time will be. So you can repeatedly restock and hit the enemy before they can do their reinforcements. So you can just have a little bit more effectiveness just by being able to hit kind of more often and with repeat hits with less time in between. However, there is of course a risk if you put it a little bit too close to the front of the battlefield and your opponents start progressing towards your keep. You could get relocated, which is the process of them sieging your keep, and then you get relocated to a random area within your territories. So potentially, if you move a little bit further back, you might be less open to this risk. Also, being close means you're less likely to get sniped, which is where your opponent does what I said earlier, where they kind of block off reinforcement paths. Sniping I'll talk about a little bit more later on, but the shorter your reinforcements or travel times, the less likely you are to get sniped. So you kind of got to weigh up the risk-free reward here on where you place your settlement. If you do get relocated, it's not the end of the world. You just get a little bit of inconvenience by being moved elsewhere. And as long as your relocation timer has expired, you can then just relocate yourself again straight back to the front line if you wanted by having a second pad set up. And all you'll lose there is a small amount of resources. So it's really not the end of the world. So you want to be placed in the most efficient way possible. But what is the most efficient settlement placement? Now, most people would say putting your settlement right at the front of the battlefield is always the best choice and you should always choose to be at the front. Whereas I'd argue you need to take more accountability for your team dynamic and the situation at hand. For example, some areas, like some of the passes, particularly in the north and west areas of the map, only have very small areas you can build in, so you can only fit a very select number of settlements. If that's the case, you and your team should be tactical in placing who you need in that area. If you need someone who's going to tile loads, then maybe putting one of your free-to-play players in there would be best, but it's likely you're going to want to push through in that area or defend that area, so it'd probably be best to put as close to the front of the battlefield your most active, strongest players. The reason for that is they can then have the maximum effectiveness of that short reinforcement time and that short travel time. But you want to have your best players right at the front line usually. Now, previously there was a restriction around where you could place your settlement, where you could not have it touching an obstructed tile. This meant a river, mountain, or an opponent's settlement, which meant you had to leave a one-tile gap, so there was a limit to how many settlements you could have compressed into a certain area. With these lifted, I'm sure there's going to be a million different tactical ways that you could use this. For example, to block off certain funneled areas by filling it up with settlements. As you can see, I've got a few ideas up on the screen now, but feel free in your server to come up with whatever weird and wacky solutions that you can come up with to try and make the most of your settlement placement. Just make sure you give the key consideration to the things I mentioned earlier. However, it does allow for more of your strongest players to fit closer to the battlefield without that one tile restriction. Now, I said I'd talk through tactical forts, but we're going to talk through all different types of forts here. So these are all different ways of getting your commanders and armies close to the battlefield when your settlement isn't directly on the front line. And that is forts, fortresses, and tactical forts. Now, the most common way and most commonly seen will be a fort. This is through basically you take a tile. It'll be a single tile, not one of the 2x2 wide tiles. It'll be a small tile, and then you pay 3 AP and a handful of resources to build a fort. And the purpose of this is to house armies, and when they get defeated or recalled, they will come straight back to the fort rather than going all the way back to settlement. So you can reduce your travel times and also reduce those march times by not sending from your settlement all the time. And you can also increase the kind of reach of your army so you can occupy tiles at a longer range than just those of your settlement range. So they can be upgraded up to 6 times, which costs a gradually higher amount of resource and time. And the higher the level fort, the more armies it can hold, and also the higher amount of siege that it takes for an opponent to destroy it. Very high level forts can hold troops as well, but I'll hold off on talking this through until I get to tactical forts. But essentially a fort is just a way of you extending your range and reducing those march times by travelling from a kind of portable location. Which is where I come into fortresses. Now, a fortress is a very similar thing. It can house only one army and has a smaller range than a fort. However, it can be used by everyone within your fellowship. So basically, if one of your leaders of your fellowship decides to build a fortress, usually it'll be built at a tactical location close to a key objective so that the whole fellowship can come together and get one army into that fellowship and then use the surrounding tiles to build forts and get range, which then means everyone can basically be at that key location ready for whatever the plans are there. So you'll want to be sure to keep an eye out in the chat log and also in fellowship pins for when fortresses are built, and make sure to get your forts built at key tactical locations. Other than this, it doesn't have a lot of use, like it can't hold soldiers, for example, but it is one of the key mechanics for getting your fellowship's commanders as close to the front line as possible. Now, tactical forts. These are a very new addition and, in my opinion, a huge improvement on the game. Sometimes you can't always move your settlement to the very front line, but you also don't want to be sending reinforcements from halfway across the map and waiting 3 hours for your commander to be reinforced in his fort. Obviously, this won't be practical and won't keep you on the battlefield consistently. The solution to this is a tactical fort. The way you build a tactical fort is you have to have a maximum upgraded regular fort, so that's a level 6 fort, which will cost a lot of time and resources, obviously. And then you also have to own 3 tiles around this in a 2x2 square. Now, it can't be a 200 power tile or a 2x2 tile. It has to be 4 individual single tiles owned by yourself in a square. Now, once you've got that level 6 fort on, you can then choose to upgrade it to a tactical fort, which again will take a little bit of time. I think it's about 8 hours. It might be 5, but I'm pretty sure it's 8 hours. And then once that's completed, you'll have your tactical fort, and you can then continue to upgrade your tactical fort, I believe, another 5 or 6 times. Now, the benefit of a tactical fort, why you would do this, is that you can actually house troops within your tactical fort. So it has all the operating effectiveness of a regular fort, but you can also house troops within your tactical fort. What this means is you can send troops from your settlement to wait in the fort, so when your army needs reinforcing, they'll only have to travel from that tactical fort to your commander, which can massively reduce reinforcement times. It's almost like having a kind of de facto settlement placed close to the front line, which is just awesome to see and very, very useful for reinforcing your commanders as quickly as possible and keeping you active on the battlefield. It's also useful if your team is fighting on 2 different fronts. You can have your settlement near the front line of one front and a tactical fort on the other, so you can maintain short reinforcement times in both areas. Now, a little tip on this. So you can house troops in both high-level forts but primarily tactical forts. One way to get a safe troop travel from your settlement to these forts or tactical forts is through using the transport function. Now, you can use reinforce to increase the number of troops on there, but then what will happen is this huge number of troops could be up to, say, I think it's about 36,000 troops, or at least value of troops, that travel to the tactical fort. If you send them that way, you are open to being sniped by an opponent, which then means you lose that enormous number of troops. The better way to do this instead is to use the transport feature. So what you do is you'll create an army which will have one commander with 1 troop. Can't be a flying troop, just a regular troop. I'd recommend cavalry as they have faster marching times. And I'd also recommend the commander be someone like Frodo and Sam or Merry and Pippin, as they have skills for quicker marching times as well, which can cut that transport time down. You use these, and then what you do is you click transport, and then you allocate the troops you want to transport to the tactical fort or fort to them, and then they will transport them up to the fort and then come back again. Now, why would you do this compared to a reinforcement? The reason you do it this way is if an opponent snipes that transporting commander, the only thing that dies is that single commander and that single troop. All the other troops he was transporting just come straight back to settlement with no loss. So you basically save yourself an enormous amount of risk by doing it this way. So I definitely recommend doing it this way. And by using a commander like Merry and Pippin, you can get that increased march time as well. So you won't have to wait as long as well. So it's kind of twofold benefits: less wait and significantly safer travel as well. Now, moving on, what kind of tactics can you use when you're actually on the battlefield, not just where you place your forts or your settlement or the very, very basics? Now, this is offensive tiling and how you can progress across the battlefield effectively and make it difficult for your opponents to remove you. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is a bunker position. Now, bunker position is a tile. It can be any tile, but people often choose to use higher power tiles, as then eventually, if your armies are defeated, the tile itself can help you lose a little bit of enemy army as well. But essentially, a tile that you and your fellowship or your faction choose to stack on and defend. If you stack multiple armies on here, it becomes significantly more difficult for your opponents to remove you. So why would you do this? Well, say you defeat the army on top of the tile, you'd normally then go straight into capturing the tile. Whereas if you've got two armies defending it, they would then go straight into battle with that second army. And if they're depleted, they then might lose on that as well. So then you get that opponent's commander straight out for the 10-minute timer plus his march. So yeah, the reason you take a bunker tile is to kind of get as much defence as possible to make it as difficult as possible for your opponents to take that tile. If you can lock in an area effectively with a bunker tile, it will. You can basically maintain your foothold while stopping your opponents from fighting back. Now, if you combine this with the second tip here, which is guard cycling, this is an old method that's come back from Rise to War Classic and is a very effective method for holding down a bunker tile. Guard cycling is essentially the process of taking turns guarding a bunker position. If you take all the tiles around your bunker tile with so your fellowship takes all these tiles, when you press guard, you will defend all those tiles within a 1 tile radius. Guard cycling is the process of all of you basically taking turns to do the guard, and what that means is if you take a hit, you drop your guard whilst you reinforce. Another person will have their guard up, so the next opponent that comes in doesn't hit your half full army, they'll hit someone else's full army, and it will basically stop you from ever getting fully defeated. If you just get a draw, for example, you won't be fully defeated. You can then reinforce on the tile and you won't have to march home back to a fort or settlement and then back to the tile. You can keep everyone on that tile for as long as possible and make sure the opponents have the hardest time possible defeating the armies, as they're always hitting full armies. The other thing you can do is if an opponent draws on the tile, someone else can throw up their guard, and if they throw up that guard, it'll immediately engage the army which is drawn with their fellowship's army, which is amazing because then that opponent's army is weakened and you can then just easily sweep away what's left and make sure they can't come back anytime soon. So if you do this with plenty of commanders on there and just keep stacking them up, you can make sure your opponents can't shift you from that bunker tile. And you can then wait till you have enough armies there to then progress to your next bunker tile and piece by piece move forward on your battlefront. This is a tactic that all the best teams use with varying levels of success depending on who they're facing against. But normally this is the most effective method for progressing on the battlefield and will always be something that I'll encourage whilst I'm playing in my servers. Now, how do you break an enemy guard cycle? Well, there's only really one way to do it, and that is a burst fire. So what that means is rather than each of you attacking one by one and just hitting that tile one, letting them change guard, and then doing it again, and then you basically just let your opponents reinforce whilst you wait and then you attack single again. That's not going to make a dent because they'll just keep reinforcing. Instead, what you need to do is you need to get a burst fire. What you need to do is you need to get at least as many armies of your own as the opponent has stacked on the tile and send them all at once. Keep an eye on each other's march times, communicate in chat so you all land at the same time, and then each of you can hit through that guard one by one, making sure to wipe out the enemy armies and send them home, and quickly the number of armies on that bunker tile will reduce, and you can then keep progressing through and then hit the tile yourself. So you need to make sure you have an equivalent force at least to be able to do this, and they won't be able to keep throwing up guards and then reinforcing because you'll be hitting straight through, and eventually there won't be any healthy armies left. They'll have no guard up and you can start taking those tiles. So that's the best way to defeat an enemy guard cycle. Kind of the only other way to stop it is by cutting off opponents' reinforcement paths. Because if you can stop them reinforcing, of course those guards won't come up. So if they're not guarding because they don't have full armies, you can then slowly but surely chip away at the armies that are there. But this isn't as effective as just doing a burst fire if you can get an equivalent force together. Now again, this is more about offensive tiling, that's a bit more defensive burst fire. But we'll talk about offensive tiling. The next is the spearhead, and this is how you make a progression through enemy tiles. So we'll talk about this a little bit on defensive tiling, but usually an opponent will use blanket coverage by taking all tiles in an area to stop you progressing, or at least delay your progression as much as possible. Best way to do this, to get through this, is by forming almost like a spear. You'll do this by forging a path through your opponent, say about 3 tiles wide, and you'll just push along in a straight line, because that way, if you've only got say you've only got a 1 tile wide path, your opponent could just capture a tile, say 3 or 4 back from where you are, and it then cuts off your reinforcement path. So if you keep it nice and wide, at least 3 tiles wide, your opponent can't do that easily before one of your other armies comes in and stops the opponent trying to cut you off. So you'll have several players coordinate here. Some will take the next line, while others guard the tiles behind them, and then you'll swap over whilst the next people push on to the next line, and you'll basically slowly but surely rotate and just keep forming a long spear with those strong armies at the spearhead. And you'll just do that until you get to a bunker position, and then you can all hunker down and get as many new armies coming in as possible, get yourself reinforced, for example, and then you can progress again with that spearhead movement up until your next bunker tile. Another offensive tiling technique is to use flanking, and this is kind of not talking about flanking in a map-wide context, as in moving to another area and going around your opponent. Just within a single area, you can send small tile armies to flank and basically take another couple of paths a little bit away from your main armies. And what this will do is this will force an opponent's army to try and stop you making a path. They'll have to send at that and clear up that commander that's doing the paving, and often, because they don't know whether you're using a strong or a weak army there, they may choose to send one of their main strongest armies, and therefore you're wasting some of their stamina that they're using up defending to move over there, and you're also wasting their time to march away from your main spear, and you're basically just clearing a path for your main spear by causing a distraction so they can keep progressing up that middle area. Now, talking about defensive tiling, I mentioned blanket coverage. Now this is on the front line when your opponents are progressing against you, often outnumbered as well, so an overwhelming force. Stamina and time will be their primary limitation. Occupying a tile takes them 20 stamina, whereas marching across tiles can only take 10, and it won't cost anything at all if they can occupy a tile 3 away from where they are. Instead, if you take every tile along that path, they'll have to use 3 occupations to get there, which will cost them additional stamina. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to capture every single tile between your opponent's objective and where they are currently, just to make it as difficult as possible for them to take those tiles, use up as much stamina as possible, and making sure they're having to use those stamina regens, potions or invigoration. You know, these are all resources your opponents are having to use. So if you take as many tiles as possible, you can make sure they're using as much resource as possible. Now you can combine this with bait armies as well. So when the opponent is in the process of trying to force their way through a blanket coverage area, if they do it by trying to take almost every tile, they might not use the spearhead technique, they might instead just try and take every tile. You can leave bait armies placed kind of 1 tile away from the front line, and this can be a mix of your main armies and also weak or bait armies as well. The purpose of this is to get your opponent thinking that there is an army there defending it. So instead of sending a really weak tiling army to take it, that because they think you might throw up a guard and defeat their weak tile army, they'll have to use their strongest armies. And that'll make sure you're using the stamina, therefore, of their strongest armies all the time, so they can't progress as high as they can. Or when you guys come to do a push back, their strongest armies will be limited by stamina and unable to stop your progression. The reason you want to mix a few kind of weak armies in here is that you can then have kind of a better coverage if it's a wide area, and you can also swap around your bait armies and your strong armies. So where your opponent thinks a bait army is, they might then push up that way. But if you've swapped it out for a strong army, they won't be surprised. They'll send like a weak tiler up there, and you can then just catch them in a guard and get a nice free win and a free supply of merit. So if you kind of use this bait army technique, you can get a couple of nice easy wins and also waste opponents' resources on their most important armies. Second part of defensive tiling, I've kind of already mentioned the switch part here, which is the kind of what I just mentioned around switching, baiting armies. But the next is to use defensive structures. In your blanket coverage area, or any kind of bottleneck area that the opponents have to come through, particularly on the front lines, and if there's low power tiles, you'll want to build structures. So these are forts, workshops, troop lairs, for example. If you build these, and once they're built, they can usually only take around 15 minutes, particularly for the workshops and I think some of the lairs as well. They have a higher siege requirement than the base tile. So the opponent will have to use a stronger army in order to break through that siege. They can't just send a really weak army with minimal numbers of troops to take it, because they have to have enough siege to break through this structure. So this again makes sure that they're wasting stamina on their most important armies, which again is key. You're just basically trying to whittle down the resources of your opponent while keeping your own as fresh as possible to give yourself that advantage. And next up is defensive tiling is cutting the head. Now this is talking about spearheading, so that spear technique and moving forward. How can you stop against that? Now what I call it is cutting the head, and this is rather than attacking those that are progressing at the front of the line, you instead pick away a little bit further back, and you then choose to attack that area and try and close up their reinforcement or march area, so they then can't continue on at the head of that spear. You're trying to cut through the middle of the spear area, so cutting through that path. What this will force the opponents to do is come back away from the front line and instead defend the middle of that spear. You can then put tiler armies to kind of push the front line back a little bit, knock them a little way back, or it will force your opponents to split their commanders, some on the front, some on the middle, and you can then pick them off a little bit better if you are appropriately prepared with a successful defensive force. So that can just help you defend more successfully against enemy progression. Now, this is one of the most important things, I think. Now, listen carefully, particularly if you're a free-to-play or low-spend player, as sniping has way more value than most people think. I'm going to give credit here to John117, who is in my server. I think he was originally in Mine, and then he moved over to Luna, and we'll be playing in Luna with us next season, for doing some of this write-up and giving me the kind of framework for this. He used this with startling efficiency last server. I will try and put up a screen of him showing how many troops he'd taken, but say you're a free-to-play player, you can probably only hope to take out half or a full enemy army depending on what level they are. But what if I told you instead there's a method where you can take out 10, 15, 20 enemy armies worth of troops with barely any loss yourself? Well, that method is sniping. So what is sniping? So sniping is the process of taking out enemy armies or reinforcements as they're on their way to a specific area. Usually you do this with reinforcements. The reason you do it on reinforcements is that they don't have any commanders attached to them. They're just troops marching on their own. So if you hit them, you may not get very much merit or experience, but what you will get is you'll get a huge amount of enemy troop loss whilst taking almost no loss yourself, because the enemy troops don't have any support from their commanders or any damage being dealt because they don't have commanders. So you take out an enormous number of troops almost for completely free yourself. Now, how's the best way to do this? So the best tips I've got are just sitting along here in a kind of step-by-step process. The first of this is to find a good fort location. Now, of course, you're going to need to have a fort close to enemy reinforcement lines. Best places for fort location is near those enemy reinforcement lines, but away from where they can't hit it. So the opposite side of a river, for example, where they don't own the crossing to get round to stop you. On the other side of a mountain range. There's a million different ways you can put it, but basically you want your fort to be out of reach if possible. If no other options available, maybe a little bit away from the reinforcement lines so that your opponents can't see the fort. But you'll want to be kind of as close as possible and out of reach if possible. Second tip is to scout the area, and this is usually the process of sending kind of a single eagle or flying unit on a very weak army just around the place to try and improve your vision, because of course in this game you have fog of war. You can't see everything that's going on when you don't have armies nearby, or your fellowship and faction don't have armies nearby. So you'll kind of want to send your commanders all over the place to try and find the most effective area where sniping would begin. And this will usually happen where a lot of different reinforcements lines coincide on a single tile. And when you do this, you can kind of mark those areas on your map by just putting a little pin on them, and then you can start looking to then get, again, fort locations in good areas near these coinciding reinforcement lines. So once you've done that and spotted enemy reinforcement lines, you want to move a commander onto that reinforcement line, but you want to keep an eye out and identify your targets in particular. What I mean by this is reinforcements travel very quickly because they're just troops moving towards the opponent's commanders. They tend to move a lot quicker than marching armies. So if you see multiple lines coming towards you, or multiple armies on the reinforcement line coming towards you, spot those that are slow, because that will probably be an enemy with commanders and troops are allocated to them, so you're likely to take a lot more loss. And you can just move off the line and let those march by, and then move back on the line to only catch those which move quickly. You basically want to make sure you're only hitting reinforcements so that you can get those no loss wins and take out a ton of enemy troops. And this is the snipe part. So it's simple as anything. You just make sure you're on the line, so as they're marching past, they march through your commander and basically just instantly die. It's so devastating, of course, because they don't have any commanders, they don't deal any damage, they just instantly die off, and your opponent also kind of gets the twofold problem of his commander on the front line now doesn't have any troops either, so he's left exposed for those battling on the front line. So you're both helping your commanders on the front line and your friends, whilst also racking up massive losses for the enemies. Whilst it might not get the same amount of credit, it's not going to push you to the top of your contribution rankings on your season. It's not going to give you an enormous amount of XP and level up your commanders, and it's not going to give you a ton of merit. But for those that can do this effectively, you will be one of the most valuable players on the battlefield, and you can trust me on this, because you will get more troop loss on the enemy than even some of your most whaled fellowship commanders, for example. Now, other tips around sniping. You can use a method called funneling. Now, this is a way of, if you spot an area, say, that has multiple reinforcement lines, but they don't coincide, what you can do is you can move these sniping lines. You can move these reinforcement lines so they're more easily sniped on a single tile. And this is done by taking some of the tiles along, blocking reinforcement lines on those areas, and then when the army gets there, they'll try and find an alternate route, and often they'll then move down the nearest free tile, which will funnel them into a single area. So if you capture, say there's like a 3 wide radius, if you capture the 2 outside ones and leave the middle, often they'll then travel down the middle, and you're then funneling more of these marches straight into your commander, so you'll get more snipes available. So you can almost artificially create a coinciding reinforcement line, which is amazing to do. This particularly works well on the edges of like passes and crossings, for example, where there's a lot of narrow areas and you can quite easily close up that gap to stop the enemy and force them down that kind of funnel. Now, how can you stop an enemy who's trying to snipe you? I can say from fact here that John, as you can see from the screenshots I've shown, used this very effectively against us in our server, particularly early on. But how can you do this? Well, the most obvious way to remove the sniper is, of course, to remove his access. As soon as you spot an opponent scouting, keep an eye out and see where he starts to build forts, where he starts occupying tiles, and if you can, destroy them before they're built. The best time to destroy them is before they're built, as they have a lower siege value, so it can be taken out by weaker armies, and then you cut your opponent's reach, you cut their visibility, and it stops them from being able to do the snipe at source. But if you don't have the option to do this, say because they have put their fort behind a river, for example, and placed it well so you can't destroy it, the next best method is to protect your path. This is done by occupying all tiles along a reinforcement line. So if you occupy these tiles along a reinforcement line, the opponent can't just use a 10 stamina march and sit plainly on the route and let reinforcement armies hit them, because you occupy those tiles, so they can't march and sit on them. So this is the best kind of method to try and counter against it. And of course, the most basic method as well is, as soon as a sniping army appears, you just send your commander and try and kill it. But this obviously requires good reach and accessibility for your commanders. Often the opponent will just recall or move to another tile and give you the runaround, wasting a lot of your stamina. So the best way to do it is kind of protect your path and also cut their reach as soon as possible. Now, funnily enough, there is also a way to counter against this prevention of the sniping. So if your enemy occupies all tiles along their reinforcement route and you can't see a way to get an effective snipe off, the way to counter this is by getting your A team and a second army combined completely with flying units, and try and locate an area where if you took the tile and the reinforcement line was to move, it would move onto another bunch of unoccupied tiles. You then send the kind of weaker army to hit, and it will then defeat the army on the tile and do a little bit of siege damage, but unfortunately, because flying armies don't do much siege, they won't begin to occupy the tile. You then send your so-called A army, or your strongest army, and they then fly in and occupy the tile. This will then, when the reinforcements come close, they will hit that tile and of course look for an alternate route, moving them off their usual route, deviating away from the regular route. And they basically end up going down those unoccupied tiles, where you can then place your main commander and continue sniping effectively. Now, of course, this will only work whilst your opponent hasn't noticed. They may then take that tile to re-get the route in place, and you can then just move to another area. Just keep doing this over and over again, and you can get many, many snipes and take out a lot of enemy troops. The next thing I want to brush over is countering, because countering can have a huge impact on your engagement. Now, if your commander's troop is the counter of the opposing commander's troop, you will deal 10% additional damage when you attack them, or you'll receive 10% less damage when they attack you, which can have a huge swing on the output of a battle. Whilst the in-game UI will only show a counter effectively if your entire army is all built up of one unit type, say mediums attacking small that is completely made up of small units, actually the countering system is a little bit more in depth than that. It matters what unit is on each individual commander. So for example, if you have a mixed composition with some small, some medium, some large, it matters what is on that specific troop at the moment that he attacks in round and what he is attacking. So you don't have to always use a full army of the same troop composition, though of course you do get additional benefits for doing this. Now, the basics of the countering system is that small units do additional damage to large units, large units do additional damage to medium units, and medium units do the additional damage to small units, with the same being relevant for damage received as well. So medium units receive less damage from small units, large units receive less damage from medium units, and small units receive less damage from large units. Now, of course, 20% swing, that's quite large, so that can really affect the output of your battle, which I think has seen a huge rise in the use of medium units, in my opinion. Reason being that small units in general are the cheapest units to produce and the quickest to produce, with medium sitting somewhere in the middle and large being the most resource and time intensive. And also the most difficult to receive, as things like eagles, fell beasts, for example, or Mumakil, they require you to own a specific camp in a specific area of the map, so we don't see large units used as often as particularly small and medium units. So I think in general we're seeing medium units used a lot because their large unit counterpart is not as available or not as strong in PvP, so therefore people are using medium units in order to counter the cheap, effective small units. So therefore, I'd also recommend using a medium unit, particularly on your damage dealer. Reason being, if you come up against a small unit, you'll deal that 10% extra damage, which can have a huge boost, and you'll also take that 10% less damage received, which will be useful as I imagine your damage dealer will have low command and be fairly squishy, whereas you'll often not come into contact with large units, so the worst you'll be is kind of on an even footing, and it's unlikely you'll have that 10% damage received debuff or dealt debuff. So I just kind of want to talk through a little bit, kind of brush over the counter system. Of course, there are many different variations of this and a million situations where using small units will be beneficial, where using large units will be beneficial. Obviously for movement with large units, for initiative, for example, with a small unit army. But I'm just giving a very kind of rough breakdown where I think the counter system, you need to pay attention to what units your opponent's using and make sure to counter effectively. Of course, this goes hand in hand with the battle reports thing I said earlier, where if you can, see what units your opponent's using. If they have the counter to your units, maybe get someone else to attack and don't dive in yourself, as you're only going to kind of disadvantage yourself. But if you've got the counter of them, you can full send straight into them. Obviously, there's a lot of text here. Feel free to pause and have a read. The only other thing I want to say is we're seeing a lot of tier 2 units used. The Knights sometimes, particularly the Marauder, mainly because they have high initiative and they're medium units and they're cheap. So even though they're tier 2 and also will have worse stats than the tier 3, they're quick enough and cheap enough that they can be produced at a similar time to small units whilst getting that counter buff. So I think this is starting to have a very big effect on the overall meta game of Rise to War. So I just wanted to make sure to cover this and not be kind of numb on this. I don't have any kind of overall kind of war tactics on this. It's just making sure that you're kind of taking advantage of this to the max. And then the last things I wanted to talk through in this guide is talking about siege and tactics to siege effectively. The first up is safe sieging where possible. So when you're sieging in an enemy territory, often the opposition will put an army on the keep to snipe your siege army. So you'll see them marching in, even if you've cleared the opponents around the area, they might try and use a flying army, for example, just to try and get on the keep or pass or crossing, whatever it is, so that when you're sieging, they will try and use that army to kill off a lot of siege armies, because of course siege armies using siege units won't deal a huge amount of damage, so therefore they'll hope to take out 3 or 4 siege armies at the cost of one of their armies. In order to avoid this, you can look at the march times for your commanders and align your siege armies so it hits very shortly after one of your main attacking armies. So you'll send the attacking army, then line the rest up behind it, so that way there's less chance that you'll be sniped, because if they try and fly in, it's more likely they'll hit your primary front attacking army, which is a very basic tactic. Everyone should be aware of that. The next thing is advanced guard. So when you plan to siege an enemy control point and you know your opponent is prepared on the other side, so for example a lot of passes in this game, the opponent will be lined up on the other side, you can send the advanced guard to try and defeat the enemy siege, to stop them sniping, or the enemy defenders that are going to try and snipe your siege. So I'd recommend that every single member of your fellowship should have at least one full army of flying troops. So enough large flying troops to be ready to do this when a siege is coming around. So prior to attacking whichever control point, you should send a wave at the opponent's tiles around and next to the point you're trying to siege. That way you can attack their armies. If they've got a load of siege lined up to try and snipe, you can attack and kill these to try and reduce the chance of a snipe. Or if they've got a lot of strong armies that are going to try and snipe you and defeat your armies, you can try and kill off them, in which case they'll have to reinforce, may even be defeated and have to march back. But either way, there's less a chance and less opportunity for them to take out your own army. So you make your sieging that little bit safer. This is important to make sure everyone has a full conscript of flying armies. Only 1 or 2 do it, it's not going to have huge effect. You need everyone to bombard all in one go with their strongest armies, therefore clearing the way for your siege to come in. Next up, you've got sieging through enemy defences. So sometimes you will be required to attack and siege an enemy-owned control point without all defences cleared. So how can you prevent your siege from being sniped too much? And that is through doing like a staggered attack. So what you'll do is you'll have someone in your fellowship who says our next stagger will be X time. So if it's say you're sieging at 6 PM UTC, they'll say, right, first wave 6 UTC, and a wave of attackers will aim to hit dead on that time, 6 UTC, with the siege set to land 10 to 15 seconds later. So that a full attack wave will hit, clear off any defenders or any attempted snipes, then all the siege can hit all in one go. And you have to time this very carefully between you. It does require a lot of organisation to do it. And at that point, everyone then waits for everything to get back. You don't send another march, because of course the enemies will just reinforce and go back on there, so you'll lose a lot of siege. So then they'll call out, 6:05 next wave. So the attacking hitters will go again, then the siegers will flow in behind again, 10 to 15 seconds. And what this will do actually is, whilst it sounds like you're attacking a lot less, it'll actually benefit you massively, because you won't be losing siege armies. They won't be dying off. So each wave will do a huge amount of siege. Whereas if you just send every single army at a random time, the opponents could take out 5-6 siege armies at a time with a snipe, and therefore your kind of siege over time will decrease. Whereas a staggered attack makes sure you're consistently hitting. And it also then doesn't matter if you do go over the 1 hour allotted time, as when you send your staggered attack again towards the end, you can just clear the armies off the control point again and just continue sieging through. So you'll just consistently have a high delivery of siege with very few opportunities for the opponents to snipe and take you out. So this is definitely the best way, if you're an organised faction and good leadership, to take a position through enemy defences. So I'd recommend this is utilised wherever possible, as it will definitely help everyone reduce unit losses. And of course, once you've captured the point, if you then have to go and attack the opponent on the other side, having more units available still is again another huge boost. So it does help you kind of continue your momentum throughout the season. Otherwise you might take the pass but kill so many armies you then haven't got the momentum to continue sweeping through and take out those opponents. So you kind of need to make sure you're being resource efficient all the way through your season, and this is one of the best ways to do it. Anyway, I hope you guys have really enjoyed this guide. As I said, if you think I've missed anything, make sure to drop it down in the comments and keep helping everyone else out with your tips and tricks. And with that, I've been HJW Gaming. I really hope to see you on the next one.